The morning mist clings to the waters of Truk Lagoon like smoke from a dying cigarette. February 17, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakajima adjusts his flight goggles against the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, the engine's familiar purr vibrating through his bones. Around him, the combined fleet stretches across the anchorage. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, their steel hulls catching the first pale light of dawn. The sight should fill him with pride. Instead, something cold settles in his chest, a sensation he cannot name. 3 years ago, almost to the day, he had watched American carriers burn at Pearl Harbor. Arizona's magazine was exploding in a column of fire that reached toward heaven itself. Oklahoma is rolling over like a dying whale. Back then, the Americans seemed fragile, their ships made of tin and wishful thinking. Back then, victory felt as certain as the rising sun painted on his aircraft's wings. Now, as he taxis toward the runway carved from coral and sweat, Nakajima carries with him the weight of intercepted radio transmissions. American voices crackling through static, calling out task force designations that multiply like mathematics gone mad. Task Force 58, Task Force 38. Names that didn't exist 6 months ago, attached to carriers that shouldn't exist at all. The Zero lifts from the runway with the grace of a hunting hawk, its wings catching the thermal currents that rise from the lagoon's protected waters. Below, Truk spreads out like a jewel box. The Gibraltar of the Pacific, they call it. Submarine pens carved into volcanic rock. Fuel depots hidden beneath palm fronds, airstrips that can launch 300 aircraft in a single morning. It is supposed to be impregnable. It is supposed to be enough. But Nakajima has seen the photographs brought back by long-range reconnaissance flights, blurry images of American shipyards, where carriers rise from steel skeletons like resurrection itself. The Essex-class, the Independence-class, names that roll off intelligence briefers' tongues with the cadence of funeral prayers. USS Yorktown, rebuilt from the ashes of her predecessor. USS Intrepid, launched while her namesake's wreckage still rusted in foreign harbors. USS Franklin, USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp, a second Wasp, because the Americans have so much steel they can afford to name ships twice. The mathematics of it defies comprehension. In 1941, the Imperial Navy counted 10 aircraft carriers among its ranks, 10 floating fortresses that had taken decades to build, each one a masterpiece of engineering and national will. The Americans had 7 carriers to patrol 2 oceans, stretched thin as rice paper across the vastness of the Pacific. The ratio seemed almost insulting in its favorability. Now, climbing through layers of morning cloud, Nakajima remembers the briefing 3 months ago when Commander Genda had stood before the assembled pilots with the expression of a man reading his own death sentence. The Americans, Genda had reported in his careful, measured voice, were launching a new Essex-class carrier every month. Every month. The words hung in the air like incense smoke, thick with implications that no one dared speak aloud. Impossible, someone had whispered from the back of the room. An older pilot, a veteran of the Doolittle raid, who still carried shrapnel in his shoulder. No nation builds warships like fishing boats, but the photographs didn't lie. Newport News Shipbuilding, where the skeletal frames of future carriers stretched into the Virginia sky like the ribs of leviathans. Brooklyn Navy Yard, where the sound of riveting guns echoed day and night, driven by shifts of workers who never seemed to sleep. Quincy, Massachusetts, where destroyers slid down launching ways with the regularity of a factory assembly line. The Americans had turned warfare into industry, industry into ideology, and ideology into an unstoppable force that transformed raw materials into floating cities of destruction. They built carriers the way Japan built rice bowls, with machinery, repetition, and the absolute certainty that tomorrow would demand more than today could supply. Nakajima Banks left, following the flight path that will take him toward the morning patrol sector. The Zero responds to his touch like a lover, sensitive to every minute adjustment of stick and rudder. This aircraft is 3 years old, its aluminum skin patched and repatched, its engine overhauled so many times that the maintenance chief can no longer remember which parts are original. It is still beautiful, still deadly, still capable of outmaneuvering anything the Americans can put in the sky. But beauty and agility mean nothing against mathematics. For every Zero shot down, it takes 6 months to train a replacement pilot. For every American Hellcat that falls into the Pacific, another rolls off the assembly line at Grumman within days, flown by a pilot who learned to fight in the skies above Kansas wheat fields. The radio crackles to life, the voice of his squadron leader cutting through the static with practiced calm. Blue leader to all blue flights. Radar contact bearing 270, distance 80 kilometers. Large formation, approaching at an angle of 20. Nakajima feels his pulse quicken, the familiar surge of adrenaline that precedes combat. But underneath the excitement runs a current of something else, a recognition that settles in his bones like winter. He has heard these radio calls before, large formations approaching from the east, where American task forces steam beyond the horizon like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. 3 months ago, the formations had been modest, 30 or 40 aircraft, launched from 2 or 3 carriers whose names appeared on intelligence reports with comforting infrequency. Now the raids come in waves of 100, 200, sometimes 300 aircraft at once. Hellcats and Avengers and dauntless dive bombers rising from flight decks that stretch across the ocean like a floating nation unto itself. Blue flights. This is Control Tower. Latest intelligence reports possible carrier contacts bearing 090, range 150 kilometers. Designation Tango Fox 58. Task Force 58. The name that has haunted Japanese radio frequencies for months now, spoken with the reverence reserved for natural disasters. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's Fast Carrier Task Force, a collection of ships that changed composition like a living organism. Sometimes 12 carriers, sometimes 15, sometimes so many that radio operators run out of call signs and begin improvising new ones. Nakajima climbs toward 20,000 feet, his breath fogging inside the oxygen mask despite the tropical warmth rising from the ocean below. At this altitude, the curvature of the Earth becomes visible, a gentle arc that disappears into morning haze. Somewhere beyond that haze, American radar operators are tracking his flight, marking vectors and altitudes on plotting boards where Japanese aircraft appear as red symbols moving across the blue ocean. The irony is not lost on him. 3 years ago, Japanese intelligence had dismissed American radar as primitive, unreliable, and easily confused by weather and geographic features. American pilots, they said, were too individualistic, too undisciplined to fight effectively as coordinated units. American ships were built for comfort, not combat, their crews soft from peacetime routine and democratic thinking. How quickly certainties crumble in the face of reality. American radar now reaches across hundreds of miles, guiding interceptors toward targets with supernatural precision. American pilots fly in formations so tight they seem choreographed, their attacks coordinated down to the second. American ships absorb punishment that would sink anything in the Imperial Navy, their damage control parties working miracles that Japanese engineers study with reluctant admiration. Contact confirmed, the radio announces. Multiple bogies bearing 260, distance 40 kilometers, and closing. All blue flights, vector to intercept. Nakajima pushes the throttle forward, feeling the Zero surge ahead with eager power. Around him, his squadron mates maintain formation with the precision that comes from flying together through months of combat. They are good pilots, experienced pilots, men who have survived battles that claimed dozens of their contemporaries. But they are also tired, worn down by constant alerts and dwindling supplies, and the growing certainty that each mission might be their last. Below, Truk Lagoon continues its morning routine, unaware that American carriers are already launching the strike that will transform this paradise into a graveyard. Fuel tankers move between anchorages like water beetles on a pond. Seaplanes taxi toward takeoff positions, their crews preparing for reconnaissance flights that will report nothing but empty ocean. In the harbor master's office, a duty officer plots shipping movements on a chart that will be obsolete before the sun reaches its zenith. The Americans have learned something that the Japanese High Command refuses to acknowledge: that modern warfare is not about honor or tradition or the purity of individual combat. It is about production capacity and logistical systems, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. It is about turning the entire homeland into a single vast factory dedicated to the manufacture of victory. Nakajima remembers visiting the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya 2 years ago, where Zero fighters were assembled by hand with the care of master craftsmen. Each aircraft was unique, its parts fitted and adjusted by workers who took personal pride in their creation. The process was beautiful, almost artistic in its attention to detail. It was also impossibly slow. Meanwhile, in Detroit and Buffalo and Long Beach, American factories had retooled from automobile production to aircraft manufacturing with a speed that bordered on the miraculous. Assembly lines that once produced Buicks now turned out B-24 bombers. Workers who had installed car radios were building radar sets. The same mass production techniques that had put a Ford in every American driveway were now putting a Hellcat in every squadron. "Bogies in sight," calls his wingman, the youngest pilot in the squadron at 19 years old. A boy who should be studying poetry and chasing girls, instead strapped into a machine designed for killing. Hellcats, high and to starboard. Nakajima squints through the morning glare and finds them. A formation of 8 American fighters climbing toward his altitude with the steady persistence of mechanical sharks. F-6F Hellcats, ugly and powerful, were built not for elegance, but for the simple purpose of shooting down Japanese aircraft. Each one represents thousands of man-hours in American factories, hundreds of tons of steel and aluminum, the coordinated effort of workers who will never see the Pacific, but whose labor reaches across 8,000 miles to touch this moment. The mathematics of attrition plays out in his mind like an abacus worked by ghostly fingers. Japan produces perhaps 20 aircraft per month to replace combat losses. America produces 20 per day. Japan trains 50 new pilots every month. America trains 50 every week. The numbers compound like interest, growing larger with each passing day until they achieve a kind of mathematical inevitability. Blue leader to all flights. Engage on my mark. Remember, protect the base installations at all costs. Nakajima rolls into his attack dive, the Zero's engine screaming as it picks up speed. The Hellcats see him coming and split formation, their pilots executing defensive maneuvers that speak of countless hours in American training programs. No longer the easy targets of 1942, these are seasoned veterans who have learned their trade in the crucible of the Central Pacific Campaign. The engagement lasts 12 minutes. When it ends, 3 Zeros are gone, and 2 Hellcats are limping home with battle damage. By any tactical measure, it is a Japanese victory. But tactical victories no longer matter when strategic defeat looms like a shadow across the empire. As Nakajima returns to base, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, he can see smoke rising from Truk's harbor facilities. The first wave of American bombers has found its targets: fuel dumps, ammunition storage, the precious supply ships that keep the combined fleet operational. Each explosion represents months of careful stockpiling, irreplaceable resources that cannot be quickly replenished. The radio fills with damage reports delivered in the clipped, professional tones that military men use to discuss catastrophe. The ammunition ship Ikoku Maru has taken a direct hit and is burning. The cruiser Naka is listing to starboard, her magazines flooded to prevent detonation. The seaplane tender Akitsushima has been beached to prevent sinking, her hull torn open by bombs that fell with surgical precision. But it is the report from the radar station that carries the weight of prophecy. Additional contacts bearing 080, distance 120 kilometers. Estimated strength, 200-plus aircraft. Multiple carrier signatures confirmed. 200 aircraft. From a task force that wasn't supposed to exist, launched from carriers, that intelligence. Reports claimed were still under construction in American shipyards. The ghosts of American industrial capacity materialized from blueprints and production schedules into floating citadels of destruction. Nakajima lands with barely enough fuel to taxi to his revetment, where ground crews immediately begin the process of refueling and rearming. The maintenance chief, a grizzled petty officer whose hands are permanently stained with hydraulic fluid, looks up from the Zero's engine, cowling with an expression of weary fatalism. "How many more waves?" he asks, though both men know the answer. As many as it takes. As many as American production capacity as can be sustained, multiplied by the driving urgency of a nation that has fully committed itself to war. The mathematics are inescapable, written in the smoke columns rising from Truk's harbor, and the contrails of bombers that darken the morning sky like locusts. By noon, the lagoon that had seemed so invulnerable at dawn resembles a maritime graveyard. Ships that had survived Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea and a dozen other battles now rest on the bottom, their superstructures jutting above the surface like tombstones. The cruiser Naka has capsized, her hull gleaming in the tropical sun like the belly of a dead fish. The destroyer Fumizuki burns from stem to stern, her magazines detonating in secondary explosions that send shockwaves across the water. But it is not the destruction that haunts Nakajima as he watches from his cockpit. It is the methodical precision of it, the way American bombers work their way through predetermined target lists with the efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. This is not the random violence of battle, but the calculated application of industrial warfare, where destruction itself becomes a production process optimized for maximum efficiency. The Americans have learned to make war the way they make automobiles, through standardization, mass production, and continuous improvement. Each raid refines the techniques used in the next. Each battle provides data that flows back to training centers, where new pilots learn from the mistakes of their predecessors. Each engagement feeds information into the vast logistical network that spans the Pacific like a spider's web, connecting every battle to every factory, every pilot to every production line. In the weeks that follow Truk's devastation, Nakajima finds himself assigned to defensive patrols over increasingly barren waters. The combined fleet has scattered to bases further west, closer to the home islands, where fuel is scarce and replacement aircraft exist only in the optimistic projections of staff officers. His squadron, once 24 strong, now musters 8 operational aircraft on a good day. The American advance continues with mechanical inevitability. Kwajalein falls in 4 days, its defenders overwhelmed by a bombardment that transforms coral atolls into moonscapes. Eniwetok follows within a week, its airstrips cratered beyond repair. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, names that once represented the outer ramparts of empire, now appear in radio broadcasts as scenes of desperate last stands and inevitable defeat. Each American victory brings reports of new carriers joining. Task Force 58. The USS Hornet was third ship to bear that name. The USS Lexington, risen from the grave of the Coral Sea. The USS Enterprise, the gray ghost herself, somehow survives battles that should have claimed her a dozen times over. They multiply like a fever dream, these floating cities that appear overnight from American shipyards, with the regularity of a natural phenomenon. Standing on the flight deck of the carrier Zuikaku as she retreats toward the Philippines, Nakajima watches the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. 3 years ago, this same ship had launched the aircraft that devastated Pearl Harbor, her pilots confident in their superiority and the righteousness of their cause. Now she limps westward with half her air group gone and no prospect of replacement. The cruel irony settles around him like evening mist. Japan had sought to destroy American naval power in a single decisive blow, believing that democratic societies lacked the will to sustain prolonged conflict. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity dwarfed their own imagination. They had mocked American carriers as poorly designed and weakly defended, never comprehending that America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. The mathematics of defeat write themselves across every sunset now. For every Japanese pilot lost, there is no replacement. For every aircraft destroyed, no production line stands ready to build another. The empire that had once seemed destined to rule the Pacific has become a consumer of its own reserves, burning through decades of accumulated strength in a conflict it cannot win and cannot afford to lose. In his flight logbook, Nakajima records the day's events with the precision that training demands. Aircraft type: A6M50. Mission duration: 4 hours, 20 minutes. Enemy contacts: multiple. Results: inconclusive. The words seem inadequate to capture the weight of watching an empire die by degrees. One production report at a time. But there is something else in his logbook now, something that would horrify his instructors if they knew. Between the official entries, in careful handwriting that speaks of classical education and cultured upbringing, he has begun recording American ship names, not as intelligence data, but as a kind of inventory of an industrial miracle. Essex, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Yorktown, names that accumulate like prayer beads, each one representing American shipyards working around the clock to turn raw steel into instruments of victory. The list grows longer each week. New carriers with names like Randolph and Shangri-La and Antietam, ships that slide down launching ways faster than Japanese intelligence can catalog them. Light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. Independence, Princeton, Belleau Wood, Cowpens, each name another mathematical impossibility made manifest, another ghost ship rising from American determination and industrial capacity. As autumn approaches and the Philippine Sea becomes a highway for American task forces, Nakajima finds himself thinking about a conversation he had with his father before the war. The old man, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, had worried about America's industrial potential. "They are a people who build things," he had said, standing in the garden of their Kyoto home while cherry blossoms fell like snow. "When they decide to build warships instead of motor cars, the mathematics will not favor us." His father had been dismissed as a defeatist, an old man whose memories of victory had been corrupted by democratic thinking. Now, as American carriers multiply beyond all reasonable expectations, those words carry the weight of prophecy. The final irony reveals itself in October 1944, during the great carrier battle off the Philippines that history will remember as Leyte Gulf. Nakajima, flying from the deck of the Zuikaku in what he knows will be his final combat mission, finds himself facing an American task force that stretches across the horizon like a moving city. 18 aircraft carriers, 18 floating airfields, whose combined aircraft exceed the entire strength of the Japanese combined fleet. The mathematics are no longer merely unfavorable. They have become surreal, a kind of industrial science fiction made manifest in steel and aircraft fuel. His radio fills with the voices of American pilots, young men with Midwest accents who discuss the destruction of the Japanese fleet with the casual efficiency of factory workers discussing production quotas. They have turned air combat into a business process, complete with target assignments and predetermined tactics, and backup plans for every contingency. The Zero that carries him into his last battle is not the same aircraft he flew over Pearl Harbor. That machine was destroyed over the Coral Sea. Its pilot, a young man who believed in Japanese technological superiority, and the divine wind that would sweep American forces from the Pacific. This Zero is a reflection of Japan's declining industrial capacity. Lighter armor, fewer guns, and an engine that runs rough because replacement parts no longer exist. But it still carries the rising sun on its wings, and Nakajima still remembers how to fight. The engagement lasts 37 minutes. When it ends, the carrier Zuikaku is sinking beneath waters that reflect the smoke of burning ships, her flight deck tilted at an angle that makes takeoffs impossible. Around her, the remnants of the mobile fleet scatter toward whatever bases remain in Japanese hands, pursued by American aircraft that seem as numerous as stars. Nakajima does not survive the battle, his Zero falling into the Philippine Sea with a grace that mirrors its takeoff from Truk 9 months earlier. But in his final moments, as seawater fills the cockpit and consciousness fades to black, he experiences a kind of mathematical clarity that had eluded him throughout the war. The Americans had not simply outproduced Japan, they had fundamentally redefined what production meant, transforming warfare from an art practiced by warrior elites into a science pursued by entire populations. They had made victory into a factory product, manufactured in quantities that overwhelmed traditional military thinking. In the end, it had never been about courage or skill or tactical brilliance. It had been about mathematics, cold, inexorable, impossible to argue with or intimidate or defeat through force of will. The Americans had more steel, more fuel, more time, more workers, more everything. They had turned their entire continental landmass into a single vast machine for producing victory. And no amount of Japanese determination could compete with that kind of systematic inevitability. The carriers that had once seemed like ghosts, materializing at dawn, were revealed as something far more frightening. They were the visible manifestation of American industrial capacity, the surface expression of a productive system so vast and efficient that it could turn defeat into victory through sheer mathematical persistence. Years later, when historians catalog the reasons for Japan's defeat in the Pacific War, they will point to strategic mistakes and tactical errors and the failure of Japanese leadership to understand American resolve. But the real explanation lies in the production reports that filled American newspapers throughout 1943 and 1944. Cheerful announcements of new ships launched and new aircraft delivered and new crews trained. Victory was not won in the skies over Leyte Gulf or the beaches of Iwo Jima. It was won in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Newport News and the training fields of Pensacola, where American industrial capacity transformed itself into an unstoppable force that swept across the Pacific like a tide of inevitability. The ghosts that Japanese pilots saw multiplying at dawn were not supernatural phenomena, but the most natural thing in the world, the manifestation of a nation's will expressed through its industrial capacity, made visible in the form of aircraft carriers that appeared overnight, because overnight was how long it took American shipyards to make impossibility into reality. In the end, they had mocked what they could not understand, and their mockery had died with them beneath Pacific waters that reflected the lights of American task forces stretching beyond the horizon like a constellation of victory. Each star a carrier that had once existed only in blueprints and production schedules, and the fevered dreams of industrial planners who understood that wars are won not by warriors, but by mathematics, and mathematics favors the side with more factories.